Welcome to MWise. This is our very first intelligence track of the day. I'm Cynthia Romero de la O. If you need anything, let me know. And lunch is at 12:15. It's first come, first serve, so make sure to get there. And then we also have lunch and learn also at 12:15. So make sure you, to go there, make sure you have downloaded the app so you're able to register. And then feel free to complete the surveys that are given on the app, and then you're able to get special swag. And then for today, our speakers are Aaron G. Clough and Tim Helming.
Okay, all right. All right, thank you. Nervous applause. So it's great to be here. Thank you all for joining us. I'm Tim Helming, security evangelist, which is kind of a squishy title, but I do a lot of internal and external education about what the heck it is that we're all doing here, what practitioners like yourselves are doing out in the world, and how we all make sense of this data that we have to help everybody out.
I'm Aaron G. Clough. The title on my slides and on our website is data engineer. Basically, I play with the data we collect. I'm part of our research team supporting our machine learning algorithms and just generally looking into stuff.
Cool. So what we're going to do is start out by talking about something that we publish called the Domain Tools Report. It's something that we've done sort of infrequently at first, and then annually, and now semi-annually, every 6 months or so. And the spring 2023 report was just in the process of being published when the CFP for this conference was open. So we shared the results about that, but there are some interesting things that have happened since. So we wound up augmenting our talk a little bit, and so that we found some interesting things which will be meaningful to these reports going forward as well. So first, a little background on this report that we're talking about. You know, we've been mining data about the internet at Domain Tools for about 20 years, and we realized that that's a lot of interesting data to look at. And so we wanted to, understanding that it's really important to the practitioner community to understand where badness lives and what it looks like and so forth, we realized, well, there's probably a lot we can do to connect the dots within the data and find some interesting patterns in there. And from those patterns, we can often infer things about what threat actors are doing. And so we wanted to be able to do that in part to help predict the next moves that those threat actors are going to make and be able to anticipate bad activity instead of always having to react to it. And so we think that's a winning thing to be able to do. For the spring 2023 edition of the report, which is kind of similar to the one before it in format as well, what we developed, and you're going to see examples of these, are these top 10 lists of the signal strength in a second by these 6 features of domains: the top level domain, the ASN of the IP address that the domain is hosted on, the ASN of the name server that's serving up the domain's name, the registrar that the domain was registered with, the geolocation of the hosting of that domain, and the issuer of any X509 certs that are seen along with the domain. Not every domain has certs with it, but where it does, we grab them and analyze those as well. So what we do is we start off with our entire database of domains. It was about 370 million for the spring 2023 report. That number changed a bit, and Aaron's going to speak about that. We then pull out which of those domains are actually active. So we look in passive DNS data and say, okay, well, if the domains are actually receiving queries out there in the wild, that's what makes them important for our purposes here. There are a lot that are just kind of sitting dormant. And then we use some well-known block lists. We can't say which ones they are, but you're familiar with all of them, guaranteed. And we use that to pull out which ones are malicious. And then we slice them into those 6 features that I just talked about a second ago. And then we decided certain of those combinations of features that are really super small corner casey things that may have really strong signal strengths, but they're so little that they may not mean much to folks. It may be very, very, very unlikely that any individual organization is going to run across those in the wild. So we discarded any of those entities that had less than 1,000 active domains. And then we calculated this thing called signal strength, which I've mentioned a couple times. So Signal strength basically represents a situation where you have an overrepresentation of malicious domains in that particular feature compared to just the general kind of background noise level. And so you'll see in the tables that we have here, you'll see what these signal strengths look like. But it says, okay, there's a real concentration of badness here. And there are concentrations of badness, hotspots, all throughout the internet based on various different criteria. So let's look at the top 10 lists of our spring 2023 report. And if you're doing the math in your head, you're thinking, well, there are 6 of those features. And there are, actually, I didn't mention there are 3: phishing, malware, and spam. I'm not going to show you 18 tables, I promise. I'm going to show you some represented, one table that represents each of those 6 features, just so you sort of get a flavor for what we're doing here. And you can come to our site and download the report if you want to see the whole thing. But let's run through these. So in top-level domains for phishing, and TLD, by the way, is one of the domain features that practitioners pay a lot of attention to. It's really accessible. It's like I see it right there in the domain name. And if I see certain top-level domains, as a practitioner, that might get my spidey sense going. Well, that's appropriate in a lot of cases. So these are the top 10 top-level domains for phishing organized by signal strength. So .cu has this signal strength of 102.49. So a signal strength of 1 means that the representation of malicious domains is about the same as just the average out there in the wild. So a signal strength of 102 is really strong. Some of these TLDs are in bold. That means that they were also on the top 10 list the last time we ran this analysis, which was about 6 months before this one. So I go through these. Sometimes we had a fair number of repeaters, and sometimes we didn't have any or not many. And so that was something that got us thinking a little bit of foreshadowing to what we're going to come to a little bit later on. But in the .cu domain, there were some 35,000 phishing domains that were seen, quite a lot of malware domains, not very many spam domains at all, but only 18,000 neutral domains. So almost twice as many phishing domains as neutral domains that we saw in .cu. So that says, yeah, that seems to be, for whatever reason, that TLD is very popular with people who want to do malicious things online. And so as a practitioner, if you see that on a domain that already was on a traffic flow that threw some kind of alert or something like that, you might say, yeah, that merits a closer look at the very least, if not an outright block. So IPASN, in this case, we'll look at malware. Look at that signal strength. That's not a typo. 3,769 is the signal strength of this one ASN 41564. What the heck is going on there? Well, 3,500 malware domains, almost 3,600 malware domains, compared to 115 neutral domains. That's why that signal strength is so massive. A really intense, it's like a neutron star of badness. It's kind of small, but it's really, really hot. And so we see some of those. And there's a huge range just in the top 10. The signal strength of the last one on our top 10 list is only 19.86. So a really big range in these signal strengths that we see. But you know, the absolute numbers are variable. So like the one that's about 4th up from the bottom, it has 8,000 some odd neutral domains, and it has only 3,100 malware domains, so not nearly as strong a signal strength, but still an overrepresentation for sure. It's just the difference, similar numbers of bad domains in that one to the one that's at the top of the list, but the difference there is in the number of neutral domains. Again, only 115 in the one that's at the top. So the ASN of the name servers for the domains was another feature we thought we'd look at. Where are these people putting the name servers that are serving up the names? That is an interesting feature to look at for a variety of reasons when you're digging in deeper to a suspicious traffic flow or something like that. Again, the signal strengths here are much more modest. So 30, that's at the top. Remember, 1.0 is neutral. So this particular ASN had a modest signal strength. It says, yeah, pay attention to that. It's not necessarily a big indictment, but it's maybe something to pay attention to. IP hosting geolocation, so we had about 3 of these that were repeating from the previous one. So the signal strengths on this one are pretty moderate, and the one that's number 10 on this list is just barely above neutral, Netherlands. So not a really strong signal. This is not going to tell you, oh, for sure, this is a bad domain. Now, context is everything. So if it's a domain that's purporting to be something that's, you know, a US company, but the IP hosting geolocation is in Iran, then you might go, yeah, that looks funny to me. But in terms of the absolute numbers, not real massive concentrations or signal strengths by this feature. Registrars are an interesting one, and they're going to become really interesting a little later. But again, somewhat modest signal strengths, and down a little deeper now when you're looking into a domain on a forensic basis to figure out what that means and to find a registrar at all, because you're going into whois records and whatnot to find that. So while I speak to the blank screen here, I have not memorized that entire table, so I can't speak to every single entity that's on it, or all of the absolute numbers or the signal strengths. But while we're waiting for that, any questions along the way so far? We could probably do like 1 or 2, and then we'll keep going. On the neutral category, yep. Yeah, what's the methodology for getting neutral? Well, it's pretty basic. It just means that the domains didn't show up on any of the block lists that we're consuming. Yeah, so, and
we're active, it's worth mentioning, and we saw
right.
DNS traffic for them. Yeah.
Right. Everything that you see on these tables, all of it is active. They've been receiving DNS queries and responses in the wild. So that's why they're there. Maybe another one. So let's see, what should I cover? It's hard without the visuals here just to show you. Yeah. Yeah.
Are there any interesting pivots between those clusters that draw things out?
Boy, that's a great question. And pivoting, yeah. I mean, we, if you're not familiar with domain tools, what a lot of people do with the data that we have, and there's other companies out there where they'll use the data in similar ways, where you will pivot in an investigation from one data point to more and more. And often with that, you'll expose things like a larger actor campaign that's going on. So in a very simple sense, let's say that you have a domain that you're pretty sure is bad, or you know it's bad, and you look at the IP address it's on and say, well, what other domains are hosted on that IP? Okay, there's 20 other domains on that IP. Let's go back and look and see if we've had any traffic to any of those other 19 domains on that IP address. That pivot is useful because it can help you understand more about the scope of what it was that you were initially looking at. Now, stepping back and looking at these large patterns, is there crossover between a combination of this TLD and this registrar and this location? Absolutely, you can find some really intense hotspots. Now, there are so many of those that it's not practical for us to put them into a report like this, but this is an example of where if you're doing a separate analysis that's based on a starting point that you have that's relevant to you, then that will be absolutely something where you can find really interesting neutron stars like I was talking about that are very hot and a lot of illicit activity. And I think the person next to you had a question. Oh, yeah.
What's up with Canada being high up on that?
What's up with Canada? You need to take that back and find out and ask some hard questions about that. But I can tell you, when anecdotally, when folks are thinking about geolocation of illicit domains and badness, don't worry, the US has the most malicious domains of anywhere in the world. American exceptionalism in one particular way, yes, we have the highest numbers, but we don't have the highest concentration, as you saw with that. So, yeah, so it's all about, for this, it's about finding those hotspots. It's not just absolute numbers. Looks like a question here.
So do you walk your APT threat holdings back towards any of these lists to identify patterns?
So do we walk APT threat holdings back into these lists to find patterns? We don't corporately as domain tools, but that's absolutely what customers, practitioners using this kind of data do. And it's something that we're sort of looking into, but it is not something that's in these reports that we publish, for example. So part of that is because what we're trying to get to is we want to have as much sort of ground truth as we can. Now, granted, there's a huge asterisk on that, which is we are consulting block lists, and that in some way represents an opinion about whether something is bad or not. So there's no way to sort of avoid that, because although we could all in the room sort of agree on whether a domain was bad, you don't necessarily have something that's objective, whereas it is objective that a domain was registered with registrar this or in top-level domain that. Aaron, do you want to throw anything else in?
Not that
Hey, looks like we're getting close to having.
I mean, one other thing before this finishes coming back up, I do want to clarify for the Canada thing, actually. It's worth pointing out that the signal strength is really about not just the relative proportion, but what I think of as the fair share. Because what we do with that signal strength is say, if like GoDaddy has 30% of all registered domains on the internet, we would expect them to have 30% of all malicious domains if all of our things were distributed equally. And if they don't, if they have more, then that signal strength is going to be above 1. And if they have less than 30% of all the domains, the malicious domains in the internet, then their signal strength, less than 1. If they have more, it'll be greater than 1. So it's not necessarily about the absolute value or even a straight ratio. It is a measure of their proportion of you had 10% of all the domains on the internet, we would expect you to have 10% of all the malicious domains on the internet. And if you have more than that, your signal strength is going to be higher.
Well, for a fleeting, glorious moment, oh no, it is still there. It's just we don't see it. All right,
Hooray.
So let me keep rocking through this. All right, there were the abstract for this talk hinted at some possible surprises for folks. So this one is one that might have some items on it that would make you go, we couldn't complete a top 10 list for certificate issuers for malware. There weren't 10 of them that had over 1,000 malicious domains associated with them. And not only that, within the top 10, we only had, 5 that had signal strengths above 1. A signal strength below 1 means that that feature has less than its fair share, expected share of malicious domains. And the one that really stands out there is one of the flavors of Let's Encrypt. So it's been not quite canon, but close to that among practitioners pretty often that, if I see a Let's Encrypt cert on this domain, that shouldn't be happening. I mean, sure, if it's, your Uncle Joe's domain about their hobby, that would be one thing. That's perfectly legit for that to have a Let's Encrypt certificate. But if it's a domain that, I don't know, looks like it has some kind of a business-oriented domain name, then that means it's bad. Not necessarily. So in terms of bad domains, there's a less than normal proportion of badness associated with those certificate issuers that got them. So that was something that surprised us when we first saw that in the data, when we first started analyzing the cert issuers.
Before
Aaron, you're
we go on
looking
that
like,
one, there's the eagle-eyed among you will notice that Let's Encrypt is on there twice.
Yes.
One of those is their RSA-based certificates. One of them is their EDCA, I think is the acronym, issuer.
Yep, and it's the RSA version that's the more correlated with goodness. Yeah, thank you for pointing that out. So this was an interesting finding. So there are certain corners of the internet where you actually don't find quite as many bad domains in terms of concentration as what you find in other corners of the internet. So what do we learn by doing all of this? The screenshot is from a movie set in this city here, so I figured I would include that. Absolutely, there are hotspots across the internet. There are a lot of familiar entities in those hotspots. So as a practitioner, you probably, as I went through some of these, you were like, oh yeah, I've seen some bad domains in that TLD or whatnot. If you're not Rain Man, I don't expect you would have necessarily memorized particular ASNs that were associated with badness, but you've seen that. We also, because items that I showed in bold, you'll note that I spoke about the turnover between the last time we ran the analysis and this time. Sometimes the composition of those top 10 lists changes. Now we went, that turnover, that's potentially interesting. We might need to dig in a little bit deeper than that. And then another takeaway from this is, okay, and this gets a little bit to that question about the pivots. Volume and concentration don't always go together. Sometimes there are very large entities with very large amounts of malicious domains, but again, the concentrations might not be so high. But when the volume and concentration are high, then that's an area, a neighborhood of the internet that you do want to kind of look out for. So, but now, there are some interesting things that we learned since the publication of this report, and now I'm going to turn it over to Aaron.
Tagging in. Okay, so yeah, so the question was what changed since then? Because the internet doesn't sit still. We released this report in the spring of 2023, and the internet didn't just stop. A bunch of stuff happened. The biggest one is that a ccTLD operator basically shut down in April of 2023. Those of you that follow DNS stuff will have heard of this. I don't expect that all of you do because this is ours. Freenom basically halted operations in April of 2023. Freenom, if you haven't heard of them, were the company that ran the servers and the backend database and the registry for a bunch of country code TLDs, GA, TK, ML, CF, and GQ. They were terrible. Their infrastructure was flaky. We had to write special code to handle their failures for queries periodically because they would just disappear for 8 hours at a time. Domains were free from them. They were a massive concentration of badness because domains were free. And then in March of 2023, Facebook sued them because they were just a huge source of phishing and scams targeting Facebook users and meta users. And in response, Freenom did something really interesting. Rather than saying, we're sorry, we'll fix it, we'll work with Facebook to solve this, they just said, we're not taking registrations for any of our domains anymore. Freenom just halted entirely. They left stuff up initially, but didn't take any new registrations at all, which is an interesting response, I felt like. And our immediate question was, well, what's that look like on the net? And that looks like this. This is a graph of successful resolutions in passive DNS for domains in those 5 ccTLDs. And you see the little yellow spikes, that's people in CF and TK. That's the day of the announcement of the lawsuit. So you can see a bunch of those folks are like, oh God, is my domain still there? And then something really interesting happens at the end of March. 4 of the 5 ccTLDs dump a bunch of their domains. They just stop resolving. We don't know why. I haven't seen any news reports for why that happened. I've got a bunch of speculation. 30 days after the announcement of the lawsuit, maybe this was we're going to dump everything we think is malicious or can't verify. I don't know. But that dump happened and stayed that way until June, when this happened. .ga went from about 500,000, maybe 300,000 domains resolving to 2,000. And then in July, it happened again for .ml. The .ml one made some news. You might have heard about the .mil emails getting redirected to .ml. This is about when those news stories came out. And what happened here was the country governments of Gabon and Mali took their ccTLDs back from Freenom and basically emptied the zone of everything but their government-approved domains. And so they went from a couple of million to about 2,000 each, which is just basically their zone. Which is fascinating to us. We had a bunch of alarms go off because we monitor to say, make sure we're not missing things. And we had all these alarms go off. These zones are way smaller than they should be. And it turns out, well, no, it was just right because they nuked the zone. And that impacted, the DT report because .ga was in one of those top ccTLDs that Tim mentioned earlier. And 4 of the big problems, one just dropped from several million to like a couple 100,000. And 2 of them disappeared basically entirely. One of our questions was, well, did any of our block lists shrink? Did anybody notice in the TI landscape? We certainly did because we're monitoring this stuff. But one of our questions was, are your vendors noticing this? And we didn't really want to play gotcha with the vendors, so we asked a different question, which was, what is the turnover in the various vendor block lists? If we think that .ga would be a thing they should notice and remove GA, maybe they don't do it that quickly. Maybe they leave things in for 30 days because they don't want to deal with rapidly switching domains. It's normal turnover for a block list. So we pulled in these block lists for about 30 days and started asking that question. How much does the domain the number of domains in a particular block list change? Do you expect it to turn over by 5% a day, 1%, 30%? And how much does it do it in 30 days? And so, oh, come on, give me the clicker. There we go. Some of them, not terribly surprising, .com and .net are about 1% a day. Interestingly, they don't aggregate up to 30% in 30 days, which you'd sort of expect for 1 or 1% or 1.2% over 30 days, which implies to me that some of them are coming up and then coming off the list, then coming back again, which is interesting. And you get the other ones, like .xyz on the other hand, it has 1% day-to-day average change, and across 30 days, more like 28% change, which means things are coming off the list in XYZ and staying off. And GA, when we looked at it in June of 2023, wasn't in there at all, which meant the various security vendors we were watching all dumped .ga. Good for them, because that's what they should have done, I think, because GA was empty basically at that point. So yeah, data churn about 1%. GA disappeared entirely, which is good. And it was interesting to us, the ones that folks thought were inherently sketchy, your .xyz, your .monster, changed on more than the big ones, but still kind of small, 1 or 2% a day. But this leads to another question. The security vendor's view of the TLDs isn't necessarily the truth, if you will. It's their opinion of the TLDs. At this conference last year, I was talking to a guy at lunch who asked me point blank, why don't we just block .xyz? Just put in every block list, start at .xyz. Because he had just decided, look, I'm sick of this. We have talked to the operators at XYZ, and they hate that because they feel like they respond to every abuse request they get and they take them down. They feel like they take them down quickly. So their immediate response to any accusation of that is, name a domain we haven't taken down. So they find that incredibly frustrating. So we decided, well, let's see if they're right. Let's see how quickly XYZ is taking things down. Let's see how quickly everybody's taking things down. And the way we did that was by looking at the time between when a domain was listed in the block lists to when it stopped resolving. In some cases, that was negative because domains stopped resolving before it got listed. We decided to not deal with clairvoyance and just remove those. But what we got is then a lifetime, basically. We took the mean and the standard deviation of the lifetime of a domain after being listed in a block list for each TLD. And that looks like this. This is sorted by the mean. So the worst up there is with a mean time between listing a block list and takedown of 19 days and only dealing with 4% of them. But there are only 105 domains at all. I did a similar filtering before. It had to have at least 100 domains in the list, otherwise the statistics got weird fast. You've got .com and .net taking on average almost 2 weeks to deal with a domain. And then like XYZ and Monster did like 7.3 days. .mom is down there at 2 days with a standard deviation of 5. So .mom is turning stuff over fast, which is interesting. And in fact, that whole thing is really interesting because XYZ is, in this community, often thought of as a really bad TLD. But in this case, they're turning things over. They're taking down malicious domains at almost twice the rate or twice the response time that .net is. For a similar number of malicious domains and for almost a similar size zone. And I think that's really interesting. So, is it true? And it may be that some of these bad domains are in fact more responsive to complaints about misbehavior than the quote unquote good ones and the big ones like com and net. And the thing is, all of this then changes what we need to do in the DT report. And so these questions of our own report. What is the churn in the DT report? How much of the DT report stuff changes week to week? So I looked at 6 months, because we do the stats on this for every week. I looked at 6 months of the DT report to say, how much does this change? And so for each of these, like TLD, top 10 churn, it averages about 9% overall change. And across the 6 months, the malware one changes 70%. That's a lot. Top 10 hosting and ASN do about the same. So these big changes in the front to back differences, and even the average weeklies are pretty big. And the point for this is the turnover is really high. So this is something that we need to really be looking at. This is probably going to change how we release the DT report, because looking at these point in time things of just a week is actually not enough. We need to look at sort of these longitudinal things of months at a time to say, to sort of cut down on the massive churn between reports. So that is something we're going to change as a part of looking at this, is we need to be doing more longitudinal. A week aggregation time is just not enough. You need to aggregate across months. Otherwise, the internet's just day-to-day churn is really unrealistic.
So in terms of the what did we learn from earlier, I didn't mention something that Aaron just did because I didn't want to steal his thunder and foreshadow the next part of the presentation. But so the point there, and I'm not actually speaking to this slide just yet, but the point there is that in some cases, the composition, the actual domains that are in that percentage of bad domains are different. It's a different set of domains than it was last week, 6 months ago, et cetera. Now, the percentages may still stay similar. The concentrations, the signal strengths may stay similar, which would suggest bad actors still like this registrar, this TLD, this ASN, whatever it may be. So there may be different sets of domains, but those things may still have some predictive value in terms of saying, yeah, watch out for this a little bit. So, you know, you can see that some of these, like talking about some of the TLD operators, they're good, as Aaron said, they don't want abuse in their TLD. They clean it up. They knock those bad domains down. But unfortunately, you know, malicious actors may still like that TLD and go on registering new ones. So the whack-a-mole game is harder for some providers than it is for others, depending on whether their particular entity or not. But we're going to talk about conclusions in two ways, one of them for defenders and one of them for researchers. So I'll speak to the defender aspect and then Aaron will speak to the researcher aspect. So if you're a defender, if you're a practitioner and you're looking at, you know, threat actors and these traffic flows in your environment and stuff that's popping up, alerts and whatnot, I would say trust your instincts, but do calibrate them a little bit. Now, in general, I would still say don't trust unknown infrastructure. We're seeing more and more shops that are taking a posture like, we're not going to trust any domain younger than 7 days or younger than 30 days or whatever their particular flavor of that is. And that's probably appropriate. From a business perspective, there's usually not the need to get to particular domains that have just been registered and just gone up that's going to lead to, you know, a help desk call saying, why are you blocking this domain? Most often that's going to be, it's likely that that's going to be a malicious domain. If you look at young domains in general, it's not the case that most brand new domains are bad, actually. But there's a fair proportion of them in domains. Most of those are pretty young. Malicious domains that are truly malicious don't tend to stick around all that long. They get put on threat intel lists, and even if they don't get taken down by the registrar or whatnot, once they're on a lot of threat intel lists, they're considered, from the adversary's perspective, they're considered burned because they're not gonna keep getting hits because they get blocked in security controls. So. There are absolutely hotspots of badness on the net. They are to some extent moving targets, but in general, what you want is context. Context is everything. So again, like, all right, I'm from Seattle, so I'll use the Seahawks as an example. If you see a Seattle Seahawks related domain, let's say it's for merch or something like that, and you're thinking about buying a jersey, and then you look into a little bit more about that domain and you see that, well, that domain has a Let's Encrypt cert on it and it's hosted in, I don't know, North Korea. Maybe I won't buy that merch from that particular domain, right? So looking at, so the context within a particular forensic or IR type context that you're looking at matters quite a lot. And also just touching back on something that we talked about last year, large societal and worldwide events can often be a good source of looking for whether you see things that are related to that. So if something is in the news, you'll see a lot of domains, perhaps whose domain names reflect that. So we looked at Ukraine domains before. And so when something big like that happens, pay attention to what you're seeing in your environment because there may be examples, and we see this all the time, examples of malicious actors taking advantage of the zeitgeist and registering domains to try to get people to click on stuff because it's something that's in the news. But other big events like the disappearance of GA or ML, do you see those reflected in your environment? That might be interesting for you to pay attention to as well. So thinking about how the big picture plays into what you're specifically seeing local to you can be valuable.
As a researcher, as sort of your tier 2, tier 3 folks, they need slightly different thoughts, or that would give them slightly different takeaways from this. The first one being the cognitive shortcuts that serve your SOC really won't serve your researchers very well. The SOCling saying .xyz is probably malicious is a perfectly reasonable cognitive shortcut for them to have, because that's probably what they see. The researchers need to have a bit more nuance about that and be able to say, well, yeah, but XYZ takes stuff down really fast. So the fact that this is in XYZ and gone is probably unsurprising. So I'd say to the researchers, tier 2, tier 3 folks, you need to have a little more nuanced shortcuts. So your researchers, I would expect to be a little more thoughtful, if you will, about things like .xyz or about certain ASNs. And also encourage them to think about that the vendor viewpoints of the net, and I say vendor like we're not one, but anyway, are not necessarily the truth about the internet. What the various TLDs are presenting to the net and what the vendors are showing you may not be the same thing. For example, domains are going down in TLDs faster than they disappear from blacklists. I forget which one it was from one of the lists. Had only like a 1% turnover in the vendor lists for malicious domains, but they did they had domains down at like a 40 or 50% rate. There was a big diff between how quickly the TLD was taking down domains, taking them off the lists. That's not necessarily wrong from the vendor's point of view. The vendor doesn't want to play whack-a-mole with somebody who's bringing a domain down and bring it back up and then bring it back down again. But it means that there's a difference between, there's a delta between what's really happening on the net and what the security vendors are showing you. And I would expect your tier 2, tier 3 folks to be aware of that delta, because that's important. And lastly, we talked about the DT report. The point-in-time reports like that absolutely have their place, but we need to be looking longitudinally because the internet churns so fast that those reports have limited value unless they're looking across time as well. And so that's what we've got. So we burned through this a little weirdly because of the slide interruption, but we have about, I think, 9 minutes for questions. Hi.
Did your report come out before or after? Oh, sorry. Hi. Did your report come out before or after the .zip domain kind of fiasco earlier this year? And I don't know if you don't want to spoil your next report with some of this coming up, or if there's something interesting you learned from that you wouldn't mind sharing.
I don't remember when .zip.
No, that happened after the publication of this report. Yeah, boy, that's and be surprised if there were other talks at the conference that may get into .zip and .mov. It's something that we definitely will be taking a look at, and I won't render an official judgment on that one way or another, but I think except to say that it's interesting, and I know that if I were operating a SOC and looking at TLDs, I'd have an opinion about that for sure. But yeah, as far as how it's going to play out in the large-scale data, I don't know, kind of stay tuned. Has anybody, by the way, just like a show of hands thing, has anybody seen .zip domains in your environment that you've had to do something about? So admittedly a small sample size, but only, I don't know, is that for that question, or is that do you have a question to ask? Yeah, for .zip. So it's like one or possibly two people in the room. So it doesn't look like that's hitting all of us in a really widespread sort of way so far. But, we'll have to see in the fullness of time. That may change. Yeah.
Yeah, a great presentation. A quick question. You can see by the filling of the room, a lot of interest. Years later with the domain industry as it applies and the extension, aren't we seeing somewhat of a comeback after the last 10 to 15 years when everyone was migrating, let's say, from social media? Now it's coming back into the process of control as it applies to owning that domain, controlling the domain, all the areas. Is there anything you can add to that? Because it seems to me that clearly, just from the room itself, the interest has picked back up. A decade ago, things were kind of going down, but now it's skyrocketed. I just would like to hear your opinion on that.
I have thoughts, but looks like you have thoughts too.
I'm trying to organize them. So go ahead while I sort of get my head together here.
Yeah, it's from the standpoint of the numbers that we see, it's actually just those haven't changed that much. So year to year, our cumulative number of domains that we see across the entire internet has been steadily growing. When we think about the place that social media, for example, has in the kind of badness that we're looking at, phishing, malware, and spam domains, what has been happening and still does happen on social media for that is that sometimes social media networks are used as command and control. And that can be really frustrating for SOC folks because as much as you might want to as a SOC person, you probably can't block the big social media companies across the board at your organization or you're going to get a ton of complaints about that. But if accounts are being used as command and control, that's tricky, especially if you're not doing like HTTPS teardown and you can figure out that that's what's going on with that. So, but in general, yes, I've heard the same thing that people are thinking for a whole variety of reasons, not just to do with phishing, malware, and spam. Hey, folks should, instead of using those platforms, if you've got content to put out there, buy a domain name and put it out there on that. What we are not so far, I don't think, seeing a bump in that across the overall number of domain registrations. The increase in domain registrations year to year, as far as I can tell, is fairly steady. And tell me if you see it differently.
So I was going to comment, actually. One of the interesting things is Tim mentioned we see about 370 million active registrable domains at any given time. It moves around because, of course, it's the internet, but it's between 300 and 400 million. We see about 300,000 new registrable domains every day. That number is very consistent. And if you do the math on that, you only take 1,000 days to get to 300 million. So clearly, they're not all staying up. We see an approximately similar number of domains go down again. So we do see about 300,000 new domains every day, and a similar number of them go down again. So there's just a ton of churn. I mean, I think you're right that things like Blue Sky that'll let you register with your own domain are interesting. But the sheer churn of it at the rate of 300,000 a day, right now I feel like that's getting lost in noise.
Yeah, and a lot of that churn is totally benign, legit domains. I mean, I don't know about other folks in the room, but I've owned a lot of domains over the years, and I don't still have more of them than I do still have. I mean, I'll have a reason to have one for a while, and then it kind of goes away. So, yeah, so that affects good domains as well as bad. Looks like we might have time for like one or two more.
Thank you for your presentation. It was quite interesting. I had a question if you also looked at the other way. So you're talking about TLDs, but have you also looked at subdomains? Because there are quite some domains which are legitimate and people register a subdomain. Is there a way to filter out malicious subdomain for a legitimate domain?
So that's a tricky one. So first of all, we do have subdomain data at very high volume. It's very high volume, and there are some tricky factors with that. Like, I don't know if folks are familiar with how wildcard resolution works, but if you're not, what that means is that authoritative name servers for a domain can be set up such that they will resolve anything that you send to them as a subdomain. So I can send a Tim and Aaron like being in Washington, D.C. .my domain, and it'll resolve. So, so that puts a huge amount of noise into the subdomain space. And as far as vendors that are specifically calling out, I mean, if you look at threat reports and whatnot, IOCs, you will see subdomains in those IOC reports sometimes. It tends to be more the registrable domain and the IP addresses, that, at least that I see in those threat reports and so forth. So we are kind of thinking about what kind of analysis we can do on subdomains at large scale to pull out useful information like this. So who knows, maybe that'll be next year's talk if we should be so fortunate. But yeah, it's an interesting question, and it definitely poses a problem. And you then get into very tricky rules if you're trying to block stuff in your environment, because the registrable part of the domain may be, as you say, perfectly legit, but someone has gotten in, someone has compromised their DNS and been able to do subdomain shadowing and register or stand up illicit subdomains on that otherwise legit registrable domain.
And I've seen other things where people used to have a GitHub page on one of their subdomains, and then they took down the GitHub site and someone else puts up another GitHub. There's things like that that are happening. I'm not aware of us listing that. You mean you can get them through things like DNSDB. You can get the full set of subdomains. Tagging them in a sort of organized way to say we know all the subdomains in the internet and these are malicious and these aren't. I'm not aware of somebody trying to do it at that scale, though, no. For the wildcarding thing, by the way, I'll just say, if you're looking at a big passive DNS, one of the big giveaways for that is there are people on the internet who do dictionary attacks to try and just enumerate all of the subdomains of a website. And they do that recursively. So if they succeed with some subdomain, they will then start looking farther and farther up the chain, if you will. And so if you see a successful registration for things like blog.blog.blog.get.blog.blog.something.com, that is probably a wild card, because what happened is that the recursive dictionary attacker succeeded at blog.name.com, and then succeeded at blog.blog.name.com, and then succeeded again at blog.blog.blog.name.com.
And they'll keep succeeding at that until they get tired of it.
It hits the bottom of their recursive tree and comes back again. So if you're looking at passive DNS and you see that pattern, that is, for me anyway, a massive giveaway that this is a wild card, ignore all of it. And I think that is all we have. There's about 40 seconds left on the clock here, so I think we're going to call it. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. And if you have more questions, catch us out in the hall. But thanks so much.